Welcome to Atlas Explained, where every border carries a hidden story. On a cold winter evening in Vienna in 1914, crowds gathered beneath gas-lit streets, whispering about a murder that had happened far away in Sarajevo. Newspapers were still being folded when newsboys shouted the name of a man few citizens had ever seen in person, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. To most, he was simply the heir to the throne. To the empire, his death would soon become something else entirely. But the shock of Sarajevo did not create the weakness of Austria-Hungary. It only revealed it. The empire had been living inside a narrowing corridor of choices for decades. To understand why a single assassination could ignite such a vast collapse, the story has to return to the moment when Austria believed it had finally secured its future. That moment came in 1815 in rooms heavy with candle smoke and velvet curtains. Europe's most powerful men gathered in Vienna to redraw the continent after Napoleon's defeat. Among them stood Prince Clemens von Metternich, Austria's foreign minister, and the quiet architect of the post-war order. Metternich believed chaos had been unleashed not by armies, but by ideas. Revolutions, in his view, were diseases of the political body, and stability could only be restored by returning to the old medicine monarchy hierarchy and inherited authority. Inside the grand ballrooms and private salons, maps were unfolded and borders redrawn. But what was being rebuilt was not only territory, it was a political philosophy. Austria pushed for a Europe where kings ruled by birthright, not ballots, and where empires held together through loyalty to the crown rather than shared national identity. This vision did not promise progress, it promised control. For Austria, the logic was deeply personal. The Habsburg Empire governed dozens of peoples who spoke different languages, worshipped in different churches, and remembered different pasts. Trying to reorganize such diversity through popular rule would have shattered the empire overnight. But under dynastic authority, Vienna believed differences could be managed standardized, and if necessary, suppressed. Metternich's system worked at least on the surface. When revolutions broke out elsewhere, Austrian troops marched not to conquer, but to silence. Police networks tracked dissidents. Censors filtered newspapers. The empire did not appear dynamic, but it appeared calm. And in early 19th century Europe, calm still looked like strength. Each year that passed without rebellion was treated as proof that the old formula still held. Taxes were collected. Regiments paraded through city squares. Treaties were signed in Vienna. The empire did not feel like it was falling behind. It felt like it was standing still while others rushed into dangerous experiments. But the system Austria had perfected was designed to survive the last century, not the next one. Its institutions were built to stop revolutions, not to absorb social change. They could freeze unrest, but they could not redesign themselves. Every year, the empire relied on suppression rather than reform. Its range of future options quietly narrowed. By the time Europe began to change in ways that soldiers could no longer reverse, Austria's political machinery had become exceptionally good at preserving a world that was already disappearing. In the 1830s, new words began circulating in the cafes and lecture halls of Vienna, Prague, Budapest, and Milan. Students debated the nation. Poets wrote about lost homelands. Lawyers spoke of rights that did not come from emperors, but from the people. These conversations did not start as rebellions. They started as ideas passed quietly between books, pamphlets, and whispered conversations. One of the first signs of change appeared in Hungarian county assemblies, where local nobles began insisting that official business be conducted in Hungarian rather than German. In Bohemia, Czech intellectuals revived a language many urban elites had nearly abandoned. In northern Italy, secret societies quietly recruited members who dreamed of a unified Italian state. None of these movements could overthrow the empire on their own. But together they introduced a second political identity that lived alongside imperial loyalty. Then came the year 1848. In March, crowds poured into Vienna's streets, demanding a constitution and freedom of the press. Barricades rose in Prague. In Milan, Austrian garrisons were driven out by local militias. In Budapest, Hungarian leaders declared a new government and raised their own army. The empire did not face a single uprising. It faced a chain reaction. Inside the Hofburg Palace, imperial officials packed documents and fled the city. Soldiers marched through smoke-filled streets. Orders arrived late. Governors argued over authority. The old administrative machine was suddenly expected to suppress multiple political worlds that no longer accepted its legitimacy. Hungary proved to be the breaking point. Its revolutionary government controlled territory, collected taxes, and fielded an army. Vienna could not defeat it alone. In 1849, Russian troops crossed the Carpathian Mountains to restore imperial control. The rebellion collapsed under foreign bayonets, but the empire had crossed a threshold. Its stability now depended on powers beyond its own borders. In the years that followed, order returned. But the world around Austria did not return to what it had been. Italy continued its march toward unification. Serbia gained influence among South Slavic communities. Romania consolidated its independence. These new states became living proof that national identity could form political borders. Across the Habsburg lands, people began quietly measuring their future not against Vienna, but against these new examples. Austria had survived the revolutions. What it had not done was stop the forces that had made them inevitable. While unrest reshaped the empire from within, Austria was also losing its grip on Central Europe from the outside. For centuries, the Habsburgs had anchored their authority in the Holy Roman Empire, a loose political framework that placed Vienna at the symbolic center of the German-speaking world. That structure had allowed Austria to rule by tradition, ceremony, and legal hierarchy rather than by direct consolidation. Napoleon ended that world. When the Holy Roman Empire was dissolved in 1806, the scaffolding that had supported Austrian influence disappeared with it. What followed was not chaos, but competition. The question became simple and dangerous: who would organize the German lands now? Austria argued for a loose federation that would preserve small states and maintain Vienna's role as arbiter. Prussia pursued a different strategy. It built railways linking its territories. It standardized customs regulations through the Zollverein. It poured money into coal mines, ironworks, and arms factories. While Austria defended tradition, Prussia engineered a system. In the Ruhr Valley, new blast furnaces turned coal and iron into steel rails and artillery barrels. Railway timetables were coordinated. Telegraph lines were strung alongside tracks. Smaller German states were drawn into a shared economic bloodstream that flowed north toward Berlin. Austria's railways expanded slowly. Its factories remained scattered. The empire still fielded large armies, but they relied on older logistics networks and regional supply systems. To Vienna, the map still showed imperial grandeur. But beneath the map, power was reorganizing itself around speed coordination and industrial output. Trade began to follow Prussian routes. Military planning increasingly aligned with Berlin. Austria's influence did not collapse, it drifted. By the early 1860s, Central Europe was no longer being shaped by crowns and congresses alone. It was being shaped by rail timetables, factory output, and standardized rifles. Austria's authority had been built for a political world that was quietly fading beneath its feet. Austria's loss of ground in Central Europe might have remained manageable if its alliances had remained intact. But in the 1850s, Vienna made a decision that quietly dismantled its last reliable support. When Russia went to war with the Ottoman Empire and the Western powers in the Crimean War, Austria faced a dilemma shaped by recent memory. Only a few years earlier, Russian troops had crushed the Hungarian Revolution on Austria's behalf. But now Russian armies were pushing deeper into the Balkans, a region Vienna considered vital to its own security. Austria tried to stand between fear and obligation. It declared neutrality. It mobilized troops near Russian borders. It issued diplomatic warnings without committing to war. From Vienna, this looked cautious. To Russia, it looked like betrayal. The result was lasting. Russia withdrew its goodwill. Austria gained no new allies in return. That isolation became dangerous in 1859. Austrian troops in northern Italy faced French and Sardinian forces fighting for Italian unification. Poor coordination, outdated command practices, and slower mobilization cost Austria the campaign. Lombardy was lost. Italian nationalism gained momentum. Austria's southern defenses weakened. 7 years later, the reckoning arrived. In 1866, Prussia and Austria fought over leadership in the German world. Prussian units arrived by rail. Orders were transmitted by telegraph. Supplies were standardized and pre-positioned. Austrian troops marched along older routes and relied on regional logistics. The war ended in weeks. Austria lost. And with that defeat, it lost its place in German politics. Berlin became the new center of Central Europe. In Vienna, officials read the casualty lists and the treaty terms with growing clarity. The empire could no longer rule as it had. It had lost allies' buffer zones and strategic authority. Survival would now depend on reshaping its internal political order. The defeat of 1866 did more than redraw borders. It stripped Vienna of the power it had once used to command obedience. Nowhere was that loss felt more sharply than in Hungary. Hungarian leaders had never forgotten 1848. They remembered the proclamations, the battles, and the Russian troops who had crushed their independence. After Prussia's victory, they understood something Vienna could no longer deny: Austria did not have the strength to rule Hungary by force. Negotiations began quietly, then urgently. In candlelit rooms, envoys from Vienna and Budapest debated how much of the empire would remain unified and how much would be surrendered. The monarchy needed Hungary's soldiers and taxes. Hungary demanded autonomy. In 1867, the compromise was signed. Austria and Hungary became two equal halves of a single empire. Each had its own parliament, its own ministers, and control over its internal affairs. They shared an emperor, a foreign policy, and an army. In Vienna, the compromise was received with mixed emotion. It kept the empire intact, but it also acknowledged a permanent division of authority. What had once been a single center of command became two political capitals negotiating every major decision. The empire had bought peace at home, but it had done so by embedding negotiation into its very structure. Reform would no longer be a matter of imperial decree. It would be a matter of permission. In the decades after 1867, Europe entered a new phase of competition. Rail networks expanded across borders. Factories grew larger and more specialized. Armies standardized rifles, artillery, and training manuals. States that could plan centrally moved faster and struck harder. Austria-Hungary did not lack ideas. It lacked unity. In Vienna, military planners drafted proposals for modern artillery, improved rail mobilization, and standardized supply depots. In Budapest, Hungarian leaders questioned every tax increase that would fund them. Each budget became a political struggle. Each reform proposal was diluted or delayed. In some regions, factories modernized. In others, agriculture remained dominant. Rail lines connected some cities while bypassing entire provinces. The empire was not poor, it was uneven, and uneven systems are difficult to mobilize. German armies could deploy in days. Austrian-Hungarian mobilization took weeks. Trains were slower to arrive. Supplies were harder to standardize. Military exercises revealed coordination problems that peacetime routines could hide. The empire still stood, but it was entering a century that rewarded speed, integration, and centralized command with a machine built for balance, compromise, and delay. By the turn of the 20th century, the warning signs were no longer subtle. Inside the imperial bureaucracy, reports circulated describing supply delays, inconsistent training standards, and regional resistance to centralized planning. Officers compared Austria-Hungary's mobilization schedules to Germany's and understood the implications. Several reform plans emerged. One would have reorganized the empire into a federation of self-governing national regions under a strengthened central authority. Another would have elevated South Slavic lands into a third political unit alongside Austria and Hungary. These plans were not radical fantasies. They were serious attempts to rebuild the empire before it fractured. Archduke Franz Ferdinand supported these proposals. He believed that unless the empire changed its structure, it would not survive the next major crisis. His advisors drafted memoranda, convened committees, and explored new constitutional models. But Hungary had no reason to agree. Any reform that strengthened central authority threatened its autonomy. The same structure that had preserved the empire after 1867 now blocked its recovery. The empire had diagnosed its illness. It could not take the cure. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand rode through the streets of Sarajevo in an open car. The empire had sent its heir to a city filled with tension, watched by hostile crowds and nationalist conspirators. When the shots were fired, the event seemed shocking but contained. One man was dead. The empire still stood. Behind closed doors, however, the machinery of state began moving through its divided channels. Mobilization plans were pulled from cabinets. Budgets were debated. Ministries issued overlapping orders. In Berlin, rail schedules were already being finalized. In Vienna and Budapest, political negotiations delayed action. Austria-Hungary entered the war with armies drawn from many regions speaking different languages trained under varying standards. Rail networks struggled to support multiple fronts. Food shortages began early. What had once looked like careful balance now became operational friction. German factories increased production. French ministries centralized supply. Austria-Hungary tried to coordinate across two governments, multiple parliaments, and competing priorities. The empire did not lack soldiers. It lacked a single will. By the winter of 1917, the empire was breaking in ways no decree could reverse. In Prague, Czech, national councils began issuing orders to local officials. In Zagreb, South Slavic committees coordinated political activity without reference to Vienna. In Budapest, Hungarian leaders increasingly acted as if the empire were temporary. Food lines stretched through darkened streets. Rail traffic slowed. Peasant communities stopped delivering grain to imperial depots. Soldiers deserted not in panic, but with quiet certainty that the state they had served no longer represented their future. When Allied governments recognized new national councils as legitimate authorities, imperial power slipped further away. By the time Emperor Karl renounced his authority, much of the empire had already reorganized itself politically. Austria-Hungary did not collapse in a single moment. It dissolved as its institutions lost the ability to command loyalty, coordinate resources, and bind diverse peoples together under one political system.